My name is Matt Raible. I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana. No electricity, no running water. And I had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day. And yes, it was uphill both ways. I have an expensive obsession with Volkswagen buses and Vanagons. If you have a similar problem, I'd love to talk to you afterwards. I work for a company called Okta. I'm not allowed to talk about the company, but I can talk about our APIs. We have a number of authentication standards we support, such as OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, and SAML. We have a blue booth that's out in the exhibit area. We got a ton of t-shirts. So they aren't as cool as this one, but they're pretty cool. They got an O on them. And if you stop by, we'd be happy to give you one. We basically offer a faster speed to market because you can basically use our API and get your authentication needs out of the way. So now I'd like to know a little more about you. Are you a Java developer? Raise your hand. Okay, everyone in the room, all right. Do you like JavaScript? We got 1, 2, 3, about half the room. What about TypeScript? Is that any better for some folks? 1, okay. Anyone using Angular 1? Angular JS? No one? Anyone using Angular 2? One guy? Okay. Has anyone used JHipster before? All right, we got one. You guys are in for a treat. So what is JHipster? JHipster is a Yeoman generator. So it generates a project for you, has a Spring Boot backend and an Angular front end. And you can do it with Angular 1 or you can do it with Angular 2. Our Angular 2 support is in beta, which means you might find some bugs. The Angular 1 support has been out for several years, works really well. There's not that many bugs there. But I have used Angular 2 on a couple projects and it works well. So JHipster is an open source project, and if you look at our web statistics from February, you'll notice that 500,000 page views. This is both from the website itself and the GitHub repository, so it's really popular. 39,000 downloads just last month. And as far as GitHub is concerned, 6,300 stars, 309 contributors. So the thing I really like about the project is it does a really good job of motivating people to contribute. It's not supported by any particular company. There is a company called Epon. They're from France, and they have an Epon USA division as well. And they employ a number of developers that work on the project, and they use it as like a training device to get people up to speed on a lot of these technologies. But if you wanted to buy a support contract, you couldn't buy it from them. I will happily sell you one if you want to buy one from me. But no, it's not something that usually happens because it's just a really good open source project. It's very active. There's a lot of people working on it, so you really don't need a support contract. I did meet someone at a conference a few weeks ago that was required to have one as part of his company. They couldn't use open source unless it was a product that could be bought. So same thing, I told him he could buy it from me if he wanted. I'd send him an invoice. So they have a number of policies for the project that I think are really good. Policy number 1 is that policies are voted on by the development team, so that's good. We try to use the default configuration for any framework that we use. So we have all kinds of stuff in there, Elasticsearch, Spring Boot, Gradle, Maven. So we try to use the conventions that that project already provides and not do any customization if we don't need to. We only add options when there's sufficient value added from that option. And for the Java code, we follow the IntelliJ formatting and coding guidelines. And then the thing we've really learned is use strict versioning for any third-party dependencies. So whether it's in your package.json file for NPM or for Yarn versus Maven, don't use ranges because developers break things between semantic versioning releases, right? Even though they're not supposed to, it still happens. So we've just locked everything down, and every release it locks it down between them. So downloads, JHipster 4 was released on February 2nd, and you can see we had a huge spike then. We've had 8 releases since then, and 450,000 total downloads, and like I said, 40,000 in January. So how do you use JHipster? You install JHipster and Yeoman using npm. So npm install -g. Yeoman is called Yo, and I think it's a great name because you're just like, yo, create me an app, and it does it. And then you create a directory and cd into it. This is one of the most important parts. If you're a Java developer, which sounds like most people are, you're probably used to using Grails to create a project or maybe a Maven archetype. And when you do that, it creates a directory for you and it puts everything in it. JHipster doesn't work like that. Yeoman doesn't work like that. You have to actually have the directory created or it puts everything in your current directory. So that's like the worst nightmare with all the dot files that you end up with in your home directory, right? So make sure and create the directory and then cd into it. and then you run Yeoman with JHipster. And that's the power of Yeoman. Pretty cool tool that generates it all for you. The one thing I also like is the whole Yeoman generator that generates all these files is written in JavaScript. So it's a very low barrier to entry for a lot of people that want to contribute to the project. That's why we have over 300 contributors. And then here's what it looks like after you type that. It basically prompts you with a whole bunch of questions. You'll notice we also make sure and put the folder name in there where it will be generated, so we hope people see that. If it's in their home directory, maybe they'll recognize it there and stop at that point. But we prompt for which type of application. You can do a monolithic application, you can do a microservices application, you can do a microservices gateway. So a microservices gateway uses Spring Cloud support and proxies to the backend microservices. And then you specify the base name, whether you want to install other generators, and then package names, and a whole bunch of other stuff, which I'll get into. So the title of this talk, What's New in JHipsterLand? The abstract of this session reads, in this session you'll learn about what's new in JHipster. Possible topics include Angular 2, Progressive Web Apps, HTTP2, JUnit 5, and Spring 5. So I was pretty ambitious, right? When I wrote that abstract, I thought all these were possible within 6 months. And unfortunately, the Angular stuff took way longer than we expected. It was a pretty good idea that we started in like July and August because Angular had stabilized by then. Did anyone use any of the release candidates that came out like last summer or spring? Because I used those, and those were like, they broke things between the release candidates. Like, you don't do that, or you're not supposed to with release candidates, right? So kind of a painful transition, but we started in August, and it was just, there's a lot of code there. There was a lot of JavaScript code for AngularJS, and so there's a lot of refactoring work to make that work. And then also, we had a lot of problems with tests, right? No one wants to write tests. They just want to get features working. So once we had the features, then we had to write all the tests, and that just took a long time. And if you have ever tried to do AngularJS and Angular in the same app, it doesn't work well with Protractor, so we had a lot of issues there. We didn't know if everything was working, so it's kind of a painful headache. If you ask the main guys that wrote that Angular stuff, they're not as happy about Angular as other people are. Progressive Web Apps is not something we've included in Angular, but Progressive Web Apps is basically a way of having an app that sits mostly on your phone, and you can install it as an app. It also works in Chrome on your desktop, but it's a way of basically specifying that that app can work offline. And you do that with service workers, and service workers can basically cache network requests. And so this is nothing that we've prevented you from doing in JHipster, but if you wanted to do it, then you would basically have to install some service workers and make that work. I've got a few tutorials out there on the Stormpath blog that shows you how to do that. And HTTP2, I'll show you how I made that work. JUnit 5, as far as Spring support for it, since we use a lot of the Spring annotations to do testing, that's a Spring Boot thing. So when Spring Boot 2.0 comes out, it'll support JUnit 5, but there's no reason for us to try to make JUnit 5 work when we're still not on the latest version of Spring Boot. Bootstrap 4, even though that's an alpha release, we're using it in the latest version of JHipster. It seems to work well. They should probably make that a beta and get it out there. And that's the biggest reason that we call our Angular 2 support beta, is because it is dependent on some libraries that are alpha or beta releases. They're out on NPM, but they're still not verified as we're ready to go. So JHipster 4 is built on Angular and one framework, mobile and desktop. And if anyone's used Electron, it's pretty slick. I've actually had a couple Angular apps that only with maybe 40 or 50 lines of code, I was able to take that and turn it into a desktop app that basically starts up with a Chromeless browser, and you could ship to someone as an installable app, and it just works really well. So Electron has done a good job of making that easy. Of course, you can also put it on your phone and make it a progressive web app. JHipster doesn't really prevent you from doing any of that. We just don't have support for it explicitly right now. And part of the reason for that is we have a real focus on the back end. A lot of the guys on the team are actually Java developers, or they're Docker experts, or they're continuous integration experts. We do have people working on the UI, but there's more of a focus on the back end. So personally, that's one of the things that I want to add, because I really like UI development. So I hope to do that over the next 6 months, get that progressive web app stuff in there, get the Electron support in there. So HTTP2, the key difference between it and HTTP1, it's binary instead of textual. It's fully multiplexed. So it allows you to actually send multiple things down at the same time. You can use more than one connection, or you can use just one connection for parallelism. Header compression is a big thing if you have fat headers, and then allows servers to push and do notifications. So in JHipster, we've added this code that basically allows you in properties to set it up. So Undertow is our default servlet engine. You could also use Jetty if you wanted, or you could use Tomcat, but you would lose HTTP2 support. So we have it configured in here to expect you to use Undertow, but you'll notice there's an instance of, so if you use something else, it won't blow up. And then in your properties file application .yaml, you'll say JHipster HTTP version. You'll specify version _2_0. And then part of HTTP2 is you do have to have SSL enabled. So you do have to configure SSL on here. And then you'll get into the situation where maybe you don't have your Spring Boot application as your edge server. Maybe you have Apache or something like that. Or maybe you're deploying to Heroku or Cloud Foundry. Then you have to configure it on those servers, right? So you don't really need it on this server. You kind of need it on your edge server. So that is something that can be a problem. And I've done some research on seeing if Cloud Foundry supports it, to see if Heroku supports HTTP2. And whenever I've asked, basically what happens is someone gives me a private account and says, we've turned it on for you. So that's not really supporting it. That's like, hey, we're in beta, right? This is kind of working. So I do hope to write a blog post and do a lot more research on that and really find out if it is supported. I know AWS supports it, CloudFront supports it. So once you do that, you'll see down here, this is just a feature of Chrome's developer tools, where it's got the protocol there, H2, and it'll show you HTTP 1.1 versus H2, so you can see that it is working. So I asked about JUnit 5. This is about a month ago. It appears that you can't upgrade JavaHipster to JUnit 5, and that was confirmed, Spring Boot 2.0. And so there's actually a session on that Thursday at noon, LL21B on JUnit 5. The new testing framework for Java and the Java platform. So if you're interested in that, that's on Thursday at noon with Mark Phillip. And then Spring 5, the themes there are JDK9, Jigsaw, HTTP2, Servlet 4, and Kotlin, and functional style and reactive architecture. So that's kind of a big deal for JHipster because it could be as big of a change as Angular 1 to Angular 2 in the sense of rewriting a lot of the Spring stuff to be reactive and to be non-blocking. And so there is a session on that as well. That's right after this one. Josh Long, if you haven't seen him, he's a great speaker. That's in Grand Ballroom 220A, so just a couple hops over. That's on reactive Spring. So basically with JHipster, if we want Spring 5 support, we kind of have to wait for Spring Boot 2.0, and I don't know if we want to use a milestone release and actually release that, right? Put it out there. And it is quite a lot of work to be like, hey, do you want to use Spring 1.5 or do you want to use 2.0? So we'll probably just wait until the end of the year when they do their GA release before we're supporting that, and hopefully we all have time to learn it and implement it. So Spring Boot 1.5 is the latest release. That's what we have in there. And a bunch of new stuff, including constructor injection. I don't know if anyone's used constructor injection with Spring, probably most people, but property injection was a big thing, and that's still fine in tests. But with constructor injection now, you don't even have to put any annotations on the constructor. So as long as Spring can resolve those dependencies in its bean context, then you don't have to use auto-wired, you don't have to use inject. You just put the dependencies in the constructor, and it kind of cleans up your Java a little bit. So that came out in Spring Framework 4.3, and you can use that very easily with Spring 1.5. There's also Kafka support. There's some Cloud Foundry actuator extension, Spring Data Ingles, which is the latest release of Spring Data, and LDAP support, if you're into that. And then there's a logger endpoint. But the loggers endpoint is something that JHipster kind of had, because you'll see when I do a demo that you can actually hit the endpoints and tweak the logging. And so the great thing about that is we've had similar situations like Spring Boot's Cassandra support, where they add it or make it official in their project, and then we get to delete code from JHipster, right? That's a great thing. So hopefully we can do something similar with the loggers endpoint. And then the thing I really like is Spring Security 4.2 support. So the reason I like it is they've added the ability to auto-register DSLs. So with Spring Boot, there's a spring.factories file that points to your auto-configuration classes. And Spring Security now is something similar. So for a company like Stormpath or Okta, we can actually have these custom DSLs that register our security configuration. I did a blog post last week about doing that with SAML for Spring Boot, and they basically, the Spring Security project has a SAML extension that they've used to do that. So when you write your Spring Security code in Java, you're writing like, a very elegant DSL that looks pretty nice. So with Bootstrap 4, it's the most popular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript framework in the world for building responsive mobile-first projects on the web. That is their tagline. I don't know if it's really a JavaScript framework because it's kind of like more of a CSS framework, right? And they use jQuery anyway. But basically, it allows you to make buttons look good. But for me, it was a real boon to my productivity as a web developer because it allowed me to get away from, fighting about how things should look. It was just like, hey, if we use Bootstrap styles or if we use Bootstrap theme, then we can kind of just use those standards. And I like to compare it to iOS and their human interface guidelines for the iPhone. They basically said, hey, just use this, and then it'll look good on the phone. And now people have branched out and made their own apps a little different. But it kind of leveled the playing field for a lot of HTML developers where it was very easy to style things because you had this framework and classes. And its grid makes it easy to lay out components and columns. You can see here you just use rows and columns, classes, and you're not really using any custom components like you might with Angular. You're just adding classes. So pretty easy to understand. So there's a number of build tools. We ship with both Maven and Gradle wrappers. So if you need support for Maven and Gradle and you don't want to actually have it installed on your system, the wrappers take care of that. You don't have to use them if you don't want to. We do expect Java to be installed. With AngularJS, we use Gulp. With Angular, we use Webpack. And then for the web dependencies to download them all, AngularJS uses Bower. And then the Angular support, you can use NPM or Yarn. Yarn is from Facebook. It's a competitor or a similar tool to NPM, but it actually caches the results. And so it's much faster and at scale like Facebook. They needed something like that. It stands for Yet Another Resource Negotiator. There's also a Yarn project that's part of Apache Hadoop. So that stands for the same thing, Yet Another Resource Negotiator. So there'll probably be another one of those some days. And how do you know if a build tool is any good? It's got a logo. So Webpack provides the magic behind Angular, Sass, TypeScript, and JavaScript and module splitting. So it does all that work for you to basically optimize your images, compile everything down to JavaScript, and it's a driving force that makes JavaScript development possible these days. A lot of people are using it in their JavaScript projects. What I've seen is it's cool, but it's kind of slow. So more coffee breaks, right? So you get to compile your code and go away. It is getting faster, and it's getting faster quickly. But it does take like a few seconds to reload stuff. And with AngularJS, often you weren't compiling any JavaScript, right? So it was just like instant reload. So the cool Webpack features I've seen is there's a bundle analyzer that will actually tell you how big your bundles are. So you might have a vendor bundle for all your vendor classes. Then you might have different parts of your app that use different bundles, and then you can lazy load those so you don't end up with a 5 megabyte download in the beginning. So that's kind of a cool tool. All you have to do is install it and configure it, and it'll tell you where your bundles are. And this dashboard shows up in your browser and tells you, where your errors are instead of being like in your actual browser console. So that works pretty well. So since we only have 25 minutes left, I'm going to give you two options. We can either do a basic JHipster demo where I build a blog application, and we'll try to get it deployed to Heroku. That we'll probably move on and hope that works in the background. Or I can do a microservices architecture demo where I basically generate a main gateway application and a microservices one in the back end, and I run it on Docker Compose locally. So microservices, regular blog demo. Okay, microservices. We'll move on from here. So not only is JHipster generated app really cool, but it also has really cool or clean code. You'll see here we have 81% coverage of the actual code that's produced. So this is of like 10,000 different projects on SonarQube, and we're one of the top 2 that has like really good coverage, maintainability, security, and reliability. What else is new? We also have libraries now. So this is something that I've been kind of against, but people aren't really complaining too much. So we're taking some of the core parts of the JavaScript that people don't change much, and we're putting it into this NG JHipster project, and we're taking core parts of the Java code that doesn't change much, and we're putting it into the JHipster project. So those become jars, or they become NPM dependencies, and basically you have less code to maintain within your project. So we're just experimenting with that right now. There's not a whole lot of code in there, but we're just seeing what the community thinks, because when you generate an app, a lot of times what I've seen from my days with AppFuse is people want to control all the code, right? They don't want any libraries, and the libraries they want are from like Spring or Hibernate or something like that, and so they want to control everything, but you end up with this app that's just, you know, got a lot of code in it, like 10,000 lines from the get-go, and so if we can take that away and you don't have to maintain that, then that makes things easier. There's also something that's really bleeding edge that just came out this week, and that's a React module. Deepu is one of the main contributors to the project. He's a co-lead, and he's been working on this for about 6 months. But it's really starting to shape up and look good. You can see it looks a little different. It's got the menu on the left, but he is making progress. And if anyone would like to help with that, if you know React, he's certainly looking for assistance. So in November 2016, ThoughtWorks came out and had a bit to say about languages, platforms, techniques, and tools. So I wanted to see how JHipster stacks up with those. So if you look at the technology radar of languages and frameworks, you'll see Spring Boot is right up there at the top as far as adopt. So yes, we got that one. The interesting thing is there is no mention of Angular or AngularJS. Except AngularJS is on, yeah, it's on this list, but it's on hold, so you don't see it on this particular one. So they're recommending people don't use AngularJS for new projects, but they're not recommending Angular either. So if you believe in ThoughtWorks Radar, that is something to consider. We do have React up there, so our new module might support that. The modules thing is something that we actually have a marketplace for, and what it does is allows people to contribute plugins basically to JHipster. For instance, I wrote one for Stormpath, I'm writing one for Okta, and it makes it very easy to not have it in the core project, and you know, a third-party developer can maintain that. So as far as platforms are concerned, we have Docker up here. We have Kubernetes, Cloud Foundry. So JHipster has support for Docker, Kubernetes, Cloud Foundry, and Cassandra. I like that Cassandra, where is it at, is called Carefully. Cassandra Carefully. That's not the name of a product. They just say, it's a great tool and we like it, but too often we see teams running into trouble using it. We recommend using Cassandra carefully. Teams often misunderstand the use case for Cassandra, attempting to use it as a general-purpose data store, when in fact it is optimized for fast reads on large data sets based on predefined keys or indexes. So be careful with Cassandra. Techniques, Jenkins and pipelines as code. Jenkins supports that now, and we do support Jenkins. And then API as a product, so we have that at Okta, but it's not really, you know, something with JHipster. You do create an API and you do talk to it from Angular, so it is there. And then anemic REST is down here on hold. So that is something that JHipster kind of does, so you need to be kind of careful about that. And that's basically exposing your database tables as raw endpoints and not having like aggregate objects and stuff like that. So it generates CRUD for you, right? It generates create, update, delete, and all those screens for you, but it doesn't actually, you know, conglomerate them into DTOs. That is an option, but it just doesn't do that by default. And then tools, Console is up here. And what's the other one? Kafka. Let's Encrypt, obviously any web framework will support that. And then Webpack is also right down here in trial. We support all those, so not too bad. You know, JHipster's using a lot of technologies on the radar. If you want to do a continuous integration with Travis, Jenkins, GitLab, or Circle CI, there's a module for that, a sub-generator we call them with Yeoman, that you can type yo jhipster :ci-cd, and it'll generate those configurations for you, so it's very easy to set it up on continuous integration. You can also build microservices architectures with JHipster. So the architecture works where you have basically a gateway, which you see up here, and this needs to be updated for Angular, but it's still in beta. And then use Zool, and you can use Ribbon for basically throttling. And then access control, you can use a JHipster UAA server. You don't have to, but you can. And then you'll have one-to-many microservices behind there. And then this is to do monitoring with JHipster Console. We have the Elk stack in there, so we can see performance monitoring and see what's going on. And then as far as a registry that listens for the microservices registering and the gateway registering, we support both JHipster Registry and Console by HashiCorp. And deploying to production, you can use Cloud Foundry, you can use Heroku, Kubernetes, AWS, and AWS with BlockFuse. there's basically generators for all of those. So you just type a command like yo JHipster :Heroku, and it generates a Heroku configuration, uploads it to Heroku, and it all just works. And I put this picture of Josh Long up here because production is his favorite place to be. So before I go into the demo with Docker, I wanted to show you how to deploy it to Google Cloud with Kubernetes. So you can actually take a monolith. So the recommendation generally is that you don't start with microservices right out of the get-go. You want to start with a monolith, and then once you have too many people working on that monolith, then you start splitting it up. So JHipster does support that. You can basically take your monolith and change just a few properties in a .yo-rc JSON file. And that is like the metadata for the project that JHipster uses when it generates the project, so it has all the choices that you made. And then you can create a microservices app and generate the entities, but your microservice is in the back end and it needs a UI. So that UI sits on your gateway and it talks to that microservice in the back end, and I'll show you how to do that. And then if you want to run it locally, you'll need the JHipster registry locally. And then to deploy it using Kubernetes, you can create a subdirectory alongside your two apps, you know, your gateway and your microservice, for instance, and you run JHipster Kubernetes in there. And then you create a Google Cloud project. You do some stuff with gcloud, create a cluster, authenticate, and then run kubectl to deploy it, all that. So if you're familiar with Kubernetes and Google Cloud, it's much easier than if you're not. So one of the things I did a couple days ago is I created a screencast that shows all these steps. And it's about 15 minutes long, so we could do it here, but the problem is to really show you like how long it takes is painful, because you create these Docker images and you upload them to Docker Hub, and then you do stuff on Google Cloud and it takes a while to make happen. So that's why I wanted to do a screencast, is I can cut out like 20-minute delays and stuff like that. So the screencast kind of takes all those short things out, or those long things out. And then you can do port forwarding from Google Cloud locally, so you can see the JHipster registry and make sure all your apps are registered. And then you can also scale microservices apps. So that's a pretty cool feature. So microservices with Docker, let's look at that. If I forget to mirror my screen, let me know, but I think I got it. So we'll make a new directory. We'll call this devoxus. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this existing project that's a blog demo and basically allows you to enter, you know, blogs and entries and stuff like that. Since it's a monolith, I want to show you that it's pretty easy to convert that to a gateway. And then I also need the JHipster registry. There it is, clone that. I like to just call it registry. And we'll move the JHipster 4 demo to be named just blog. So now we have those two. And now we'll create a third one called store. This will be our microservices application. And we'll do yo JHipster. So you'll see it, you know, it tells it's using 408, but there's a new version out. But they release new versions like every 3 days, so the last thing you want to do during a demo is like upgrade to the latest version. So I'm not going there. But you can see what type of application would you like to create. Sorry about that. Monolithic microservice application or gateway, or a user authentication authorization server. We're going to go ahead and do just a microservice application. The base name will be store. We don't need any other generators from the JHipster marketplace. Are you running in a microservices architecture? So it knows that if you're in a microservices architecture, you're going to have some on different ports, right? So it prompts you with the next one it guesses, 8081. We'll just use org JHipster store for a package name. What type of authentication would you like to use? We'll go ahead and use JOTs. This is actually in the spec for JWTs that you're supposed to call it JOT, J-O-T. And then we'll use JHipster registry for service discovery and configuration. And then we'll go ahead and use MongoDB, right? Why not? And then we'll just use Maven because it's easier. And my blog application has internationalization support. And it's got English and Spanish, so I'm going to do the same in this one. just so the error messages or anything that comes back from the API matches. And then I don't need anything else. So it's going to go ahead and generate that for me. And then I'll go to the blog application, convert that to a gateway. So I'm going to open it up in IntelliJ. And someone asked me recently about that idea pom.xml command. In the latest version of IntelliJ installs an actual command line tool. You can also do idea space build.gradle, and it'll open it up and configure the project for you. So that's kind of handy. If you're not using the latest version, you can also create an alias that points to that. So it's a nice way to open up files from the command line. So I'm going to change a few things in here. I'm going to change ehcache to Hazelcast. I'm going to change service discovery type to Eureka. And application type to gateway. And then because that definition is there with all those choices in there, we can actually just run JHipster and it'll generate it again. But also we have entities that we've created. There's a blog entity, there's an entry entity, and tags entity. So we want to generate those again so they show up in the menu. And there's a pretty cool tool out here called JDL Studio that allows you to create a schema or a way of generating your entities. So when you do CRUD generation with JHipster, you can do JHipster:entity and then an entity name, and it prompts you, what's the name of the field? What's the type of the field? Is there any relationships? And so it goes through this kind of long and tedious process, but you can also use this JDL Studio and define your entities here and their relationships to each other. You see here's a many-to-one down here from blog user login to user and from the blog name to the blog. And so it's nice because it provides validation if you mess anything up and tells you that, hey, these files aren't here. And then you can download that and actually generate your project or your entities from that. So it's a pretty slick way to do it. And there's also these JDL samples we've started creating. So you can see here there's the one for blog, here's an online shop, and here's a bug tracker. So great for demos if you need to do one at your company or a local meetup or something like that. So it prompts me to overwrite the README as well as a number of other files. So I just said I wanted to overwrite them all. And so there are some files that have changed in here. So you'll see there's a whole bunch. But there's some that I know I overwrote before. I changed the business logic so not all people could see each other's blogs. Same thing with entries, so I'm just going to revert these changes. And then also with entries and the component. And then we'll do auto import. And I think that's still running, so I can actually, yeah, that should be okay to let run. But now what we need to do is create, I just call it Docker. So in here, you do JHipster Docker compose. And it prompts you, what type of application would you like to deploy, a monolithic or a microservice? So we say microservice, and then enter the root directory where your gateways and microservices are found. It defaults to the parent directory. And then you can choose that blog and that store. And then which applications do you want to use with clustered databases? Since we're using MongoDB, it knows that that's an option. I'm going to not select that. And do you want to set up monitoring for all your applications? Yep, you can use JHipster console. We also support Prometheus, so that's a new one. I think it's only in the latest version, so we'll use that. And then the admin password, I just use the default admin. And then it notices that no Docker images exist, so we still need to build those for the various projects. So we need to copy this command. We'll do it for store. And store is pretty quick because there's not any UI there. Oh, we still need to generate the entity. So in store, we'll go JHipster entity because we need a microservice in there. And it's telling me that, hey, there's no name. It just does it with a long stack trace. It does not provide required argument name. So we'll just call it product. give it a little more space. Do you want to add a field? Yep. And we'll call it name. We'll make it a string. We'll add validation rules that it's required. And then we'll add a price. And we'll make it a big decimal. Make that required as well. And then no more fields. We'll just keep it simple. You can create DTOs if you want, but we're not going to. You can also have a service class between your resource or your controller and your repository. We're not going to. And we'll have some simple pagination links. So now we have that in our store. And we can build that with Docker. And then we'll go into our blog. And we can do the same thing. Yo JHipster entity product. And it prompts us because it's a gateway now. Do you want to generate this entity from an existing microservice? Yes. Enter the path. It's got that in there because I chose it before when I was practicing this demo. So one parent directory and then to store. And you choose regenerate the entities. And so it's going to prompt you to overwrite some stuff. That's fine. Copy this command. And this does take a little while because of Webpack, right? Webpack's got to rebuild a lot of these Angular files it just built. And so that does take a little while. Now we can package that up. And then to get the command, you can rerun that Docker. So devox us. You can rerun yo JHipster Docker compose. So it still needs one for that, but you'll notice this is a command, right? Docker compose up -d. And not everything's built yet, so I got to wait for that. Any questions in the meantime? If I stay silent long enough, it'll be awkward and someone will ask one. Maybe. Okay, we'll go back to the presentation. Yeah. The microservices support? Oh, it's been around for more than a year now. And so it came out with JHipster 3, which was released like last March or April. And it's been used by a fair amount of people that are testing out large-scale apps and everything. And one of the biggest JHipster entities that we've seen, it was Stack Overflow, and someone had some issues with their latest release of Spring Boot or something like that. And they had 3,700 entities in their project. So some people are generating a whole lot of code there. This is almost done here, and then we'll run it in Docker. So the reason this takes so long is it does do a production build as well. So it's optimizing all the JavaScript. It's doing all the tree shaking, the AOT stuff with Angular, and it's optimizing the CSS, and it's making everything as small as possible. It's also enabling a production build, so it takes away a lot of the debugging and logging. And you can see a lot of that was just to get to that was doing the TypeScript stuff, not the Java stuff, and now it's running the Java tests, which you always want to do when you do a production build. So it's almost done. And you do have to have Docker running. You do have to have it installed and running for this to work, or you'll get through that whole build process and try to build the Docker image, and it'll fail there. So it took about 3:10. We can go to Docker. and docker compose up-d. And basically a number of them, like Postgres, it'll pull from the internet. So this is largely dependent on the connection here. So you can see that one itself could take a while. So the shortcut to becoming a JHipster expert is to just do it. Just try it, try working with it. The reason I really like it is because it shows how to integrate a lot of these technologies together, right? How to use Elasticsearch with Hibernate, and how to use Spring Boot with Angular. And for me, I've never actually used it on a project. I wrote a book about it. There's a JHipster book out there. But I use it as a reference. And the reason is because before I worked at Stormpath and now Okta, it was very much, I was a consultant and no one would hire me for a greenfield project, right? And I told people, I was like, you can use JHipster or you can hire me and it will take twice as long. But basically, it's a great learning tool, and I encourage you to create sample apps, do some prototyping with it, check out Angular 2, or just use it as a learning tool. And so the JHipster Mini-Book, I released the first version in 2015 at the end of October. The second version was just last December, and it covers AngularJS. So I had a small window where it was like up to date, right? So if you still want to use AngularJS, which is fine, just ignore the ThoughtWorks radar and create your application with AngularJS, and everything in this book is still relevant. If you want to use Angular 2, I haven't written about it yet. I hope to in the next couple months. But it's a cool book. It's written in ASCII Doctor. And I wrote an app called 21 Points as part of that. 21 Points is something that I discovered kind of by accident. My wife wanted to do a sugar detox with one of her fitness friends. And I found out the day that we started that sugar detox means you don't get any beer. And so I was like, man, it's going to be a rough 3 weeks, right? So 21-day sugar detox. The first week of it, was hard. But I also ran out of blood pressure medication. And I've had high blood pressure since I was 22. And when I went to the doctor then, they said, you're probably going to have a heart attack before you're 35 if you don't do something about this. I didn't even go on high blood pressure medication until I was like 36, 37. And so, it was one of those things that was kind of on my mind. So when I ran out, I was like, I'll wait till this 21-day detox is over, and then I'll go ahead and, go get a new subscription or prescription. And after eating no sugar for 3 weeks, I didn't have high blood pressure anymore. And it's the first time in my life. And these doctors tried all kinds of different pills and stuff, and it never worked. So now I have this system where I allow myself 21 points in a week. You can earn 3 points a day. You get a point if you eat no sugar, or whatever your definition of eating well is. You get a point if you drink responsibly, which means a couple drinks, maybe a glass of red wine or two. And then you get a third point if you exercise. So what I found for me is if I get 15 points in a week, I actually maintain my weight. If I get 18 points in a week, I'll lose weight. If I get 10 points in a week, I might get sick the next week. So it's great because I've been doing this for a couple years, and I know when I'm going to get sick. If I have 2 weeks in a row of like 10 points, I'm going to get sick. And so I don't blame airlines anymore, right? I don't blame kids. It's all me. It's my fault. And so that's kind of neat. So any questions, you can keep in touch. You can contact me online on my blog or on Twitter. I've actually started posting from SlideShare. Instead of SlideShare, I'm using SpeakerDeck now. But I will tweet out and show you where I put these slides. And then the code for this is on GitHub for the JHipster 4 demo. And I will upload the microservices demo as well. We'll see if that's done deploying down here. And don't be afraid to try out Okta. OK, so this should be going. Look, we got all those up and running. We got MongoDB running. And so in here, there's a Kitomatic tool you can use. And so things still will take a while to start up, right? So everything might not be running. We can look at our blog application, and you see here, oh, that's up and running in our console. So we can look at a few of these if you don't mind. So we can log into admin, and you'll see all the entities. So a blog, we could create a new blog. This just talks to a Postgres database. Admin's blog, admin. All right, that all works. And then if we were to go to product, we can add a product. We'll call it beer. And it's funny, the actual instances of MongoDB that Docker creates are persistent. You'll notice I've done this demo a few times, and it's got the old entries in there. All right, so there's bread and ice cream and beer. I figured those would be cleared out, but it keeps the data in there, so you can delete them if you want. But then one of the cool things is, so there's all this user management, there's all these metrics that JHipster provides for you to like monitor your application, but there's also this JHipster console, which uses the Elk stack. And so this guy has the ability to look at dashboards that show like what your app's doing. So you can see an EHCache dashboard. Oh, we're using Hazelcast now, so that's not in there. But you can see, you know, the JVM dashboard, the total memory that's being used, the heap memory, and all that stuff. If you're doing microservices, you need monitoring, right? Because you just took the complexity out of your monolith and put it like over the network, and so you're going to need ways to monitor it. So that's a pretty cool way to do it, your logs dashboard. And what I like to do is actually use Gatling to run a bunch of performance tests against the application, and then these kind of fill in and look a lot better. But that's basically the gist of it. Any questions? Anyone want to talk about Volkswagens? No? Okay, well, thanks for coming.